Okay, so I'll just give it a go and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so welcome everybody to the first episode of the interview series called Whose Protest Is It? And today my first guest is Dr. Stuart Schrader. Professor Schrader, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'll briefly introduce our guest to you, then we'll go on with the questions. So Dr. Stuart Schrader is an associate director of the program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University, where he's also associate research professor of Africana Studies. He's also affiliated with the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Hopkins. His research interests include security, policing and counterinsurgency, the entwinement of foreign and domestic policy, and urbanization. His recent groundbreaking book is titled Badges Without Borders: How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, and it was published with University of California in 2019. Before we go on with the questions, I would like to read an excerpt from the book and let Dr. Schrader introduce the book a little bit before we set out. Badges Without Borders shifts figure and ground, bringing into focus that imperial project. This simple movement reveals that the growth and empowerment of cops and cages beginning in the 1960s was not independent of that imperial background, but has been intimately tied to it. The ideas and people essential to the background were ideas and people essential to the foreground. They were one and the same. To look at these policymakers and their maneuvers to bolster law enforcement around the globe after World War II is to understand who the builders of the carceral state were and how they crafted this policy and why they did it. Racially invidious policing and incarceration within the United States, which many have worked so hard to bring to public consciousness, do not represent the sum of state building in the name of law and order. A close look at the college's background reveals that many of the law enforcement leaders who stewarded the rise of this new penal apparatus had already been engaged in a program of deterritorialized state building. They crafted policy designs and rationales overseas. They deployed technical expertise to any country that would have them, helping endow these states with up-to-date repressive capacities and bolstering authoritarianism. And they then policed American streets like foreign territory. So, Professor, how would you comment on this excerpt and how would you introduce your book? What is Badges Without Borders about?
Yeah, thanks. It's a funny experience listening to somebody else read your own words, and I'm struck by their familiarity, but also it's now been almost 2 years since the book came out. And in some ways, I feel like the world that we inhabit in 2021 is not necessarily the world we inhabited when I finished the book, which was during the Trump administration, or when I started it, which was during the Obama administration. And of course, many things are the same, but there are some differences, and some of the motivations going into the book that were compelled by the Obama administration and its attempted revival of a kind of liberal internationalism then shaped how the book, when I completed it, how the book felt differently, because the Trump administration rejected liberal internationalism. And so in a sense, the book started out as a way to say, hey, let's look more closely at liberal internationalism, the period of the kind of post-World War II ascendance of the United States to world leadership. Let's look at the underside of this, because the Obama administration is trying to kind of bring this back after the fiasco of the Bush administration. And then the Trump administration was trying to reject it, which led to a lot of liberal commentators, policy thinkers, and even Democratic Party elected officials to have a nostalgic view toward, again, the post 1945 period. And so, I was still trying to be critical of that moment, but it went from being a celebration of it in the United States to a rejection of it, and then nostalgia for it. And then now, I think it's a little bit too soon to tell, but I think it's quite clear that the Biden administration is reckoning with the firm conclusion of that moment. There's no bringing it back, right? However, U.S. global power is still a reality. U.S. security assistance is still a reality across the globe. And so what the book does, I think maybe the paragraph or two before what you read, I start out with a kind of image, or I try to paint an image, I call it a collage, as you mentioned, of a prison. And I kind of say that, look, the prison, it's meant to represent the new emerging literature on the carceral state in the United States and mass incarceration, which has been super important, brilliant, and crucial, and has changed public consciousness in the United States and around the globe about the disaster of mass incarceration. But I say, if we focus only on the prison in the foreground, we miss the background. And I argue that the background in the literature as it has existed is US global power, US empire. And what I say is, as the piece you read kind of explains, what I say is that the people who were operating security assistance around the globe, trying to win the Cold War in the so-called third world, were using techniques and rationales and technologies and institutions that were themselves crucial to the construction of the prison system, mass incarceration, the carceral state in the domestic sphere. They were the same folks, and and the book explores how people circled around the globe, traveled around the globe, and traveled across borders and redeployed ideas they developed overseas for use domestically. And just to put a clear, fine point on this, many people, I think, argue and understand that on some level, mass incarceration came as a response to civil rights and Black Power rebellion, Puerto Rican liberation movement, Chicano liberation movement. The movements of the 60s were repressed and mass incarceration ensued. What I think I've tried to explore and show in the book is that the people who, insofar as those movements thought of themselves as internationalists, thought of themselves as anti-imperialists, the people who were the imperialists of the United States, the people who were responsible for trying to suppress liberation movements overseas, also were trying to suppress liberation movements domestically, and they used many of the same techniques and practices and rationales to do both. And so for that reason, I argue in the opening of the book that we can't really understand the full complexity and underpinnings of that prison system that's in the foreground of the historiography and the literature without understanding the background. And of course, many people have also explored the background. I'm not, a pioneer in either the foreground or the background, but I think that what I try to do in the book that is new and somewhat unique, although not exclusively unique, is to show that the foreground and the background are linked because there are people and institutions and technologies and so forth that we can name and point to that join them together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's why I believe it is really important to understand this connection, the foreground and the background. And I believe your book extensively achieves this. And that's why it also contributed to my research in my PhD studies, that I try to look at this police power in a more theoretical perspective by reading Neocleus, actually. So that's why this connection that you established on the practical and real life based, I would say, research is really helpful for what I do on a theoretical level. We're gonna do this in actually sections. We're gonna start with the history of police professionalization. Then we're gonna move on to the really shaky term militarization. Then we will discuss also some key figures and institutions that you extensively mention in the book and argue. And we're gonna finish up with the alternatives to police state, and we're gonna discuss the really interesting case of Cizanckas. I forgot the name, I guess. Cizanckas, yeah. So the first question is the US world's law enforcement?
Well, we have the term global policeman, or, there's many variations on it, world cop. And what I've tried to do, and this comes out a bit in the book, and perhaps maybe more so in an article I wrote after the book for N+1 called Defund the Global Policeman. What I try to show is that there's a kind of well-established understanding of the United States, both among kind of international relations theorists, policymakers, leaders, and so forth, that the United States has taken on the role of global policeman. And the origins of this notion go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt and other figures of that ilk, who kind of looked around at the globe. They saw that and embraced the idea that the United States was becoming a world power. In the Spanish-American War had vanquished the Spanish Empire in many ways. And, you know, and there were independence and decolonization struggles going on in other parts of the globe with the British Empire and so forth. And there was a question, should the United States take on this role, and what is this role? And the thing that Roosevelt said was, there are parts of the globe where there is, you know, I think the phrase he uses is chronic wrongdoing. The international system as it's set up provides no instrument for dealing with chronic wrongdoing. And of course, chronic wrongdoing is a racialized understanding. I think there's no question that Roosevelt and people in his orbit at that time are thinking in very racist ways. But the question becomes, is there a multilateral body that can deal with this chronic wrongdoing? Now, in imperial situations, if there's a rebellion in Syria or Iraq, whatever the rebellion is, it becomes the responsibility of the imperial power that's, you know, acting in those places. And this gets codified kind of in early international law. And I talk a little bit about this in the book. But what about these places that are kind of in between empires, or it's uncertain where the imperial jurisdiction is? Should there be some kind of multilateral institution to engage in this? And in fact, in the League of Nations debates, one of the questions was, you know, about whether there should be a global police force of some sense, you know, in some sense, to you know, control, again, chronic wrongdoing, which you know, it basically amounts to struggles for political, economic, and social, you know, liberation, autonomy, and independence. And of course, there's another piece of the puzzle to put in there, which is, you know, after 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution and the development of the Comintern and so forth. So basically, these debates are happening in international policy circles, international law circles in the first part of the 20th century. Fast forward to the end of World War II, and really the United States is the remaining major global power. Of course, the Soviet Union emerges victorious, but has suffered, you know, horrific destruction. It simply is not in the same kind of economic position that the United States is in. So the United States, I think some would say reluctantly, I disagree with that, but some would say reluctantly, you know, arrogates to itself this role of global policeman, you know, with a different understanding than in the earlier part of the 20th century, because of the reality that a kind of racially based imperial project no longer has the legitimacy on the global stage that it may have once had. And whether it really did have that legitimacy, I mean, certainly among the people who are the objects of it, clearly it was illegitimate. But post-World War II, post-defeat of the Nazis, the United States needs a different framework. So it takes on this role of global policeman. And what I try to say is like, look, how does it do it? Let's look at how it actually does that. It does that, this attempt to pacify and control and eliminate chronic wrongdoing, which the term is no longer used in the same way, but same idea, by building up police forces around the globe, right? So this is going on in Europe. It's going on in Japan in the immediate aftermath of World War II, but very quickly, it's also happening in Iran, in Turkey, in other places where the United States has an interest and is worried about Soviet influence, right? So all of this is to say that one of the points that I have urged is to say that when we think about the concept of the global policeman, we should not restrict it only to kind of military intervention. Of course, I do not want to deny in any way that military intervention is huge and massively important. But beneath that, there's this kind of somewhat more subterranean and less celebrated, consistent program of police assistance from the end of World War II all the way up to the present, with some changes and deviations along the way. And I would also just add that ultimately the United Nations gets in on the act, NATO gets in on the act, other countries also get in on the act. And I think we're starting to see more scholarship that is explaining how it's not only the United States that it has been doing this work, particularly in the post-Cold War moment. And my book goes from 45 to 75, so I'm operating in the period, or I'm studying the period in which the US is operating most prominently.
Right. I have to admit that as a Turkish citizen, it was almost enlightening for me to read the part in your book about Byron Engel's, well, actually the OPS's, I would say, dispatch of these advisors all around the world, with Germany, Japan, and Turkey being the most prominent ones. It was enlightening because it is no debate topic for Turkish people that whether United States has a certain influence on Turkish policies or not. It is definitely clear, and even politicians do not deny that. Of course, during the times of public protests, I had a chance to observe police forces from outside, and what I saw was there was a clear distinction between the patrol officers, who were usually within the society, interacting with the citizens, and the ones who were responding to the protests were clearly different and almost unidentifiable from their outlook, from the outfits, from the way they behaved, the way they acted. And after reading the trainings, the strategies in your book about paramilitary police forces, it became so clear to me that United States definitely had a direct influence. And of course it was documented in your book, so that was really eye-opening. So the second question to you will be about the key figures. So in the book, you extensively talk about certain figures. You start with, of course, the First World War era, briefly to refer to the father of modern American policing, August Vollmer. Then you mention Orlando Wilson and Byron Engel. And you define Byron Engel specifically as one of the most essential pioneers of modernization and professionalization of American policing. And also, of course, this modernization and professionalization were the processes which played a central role in the US's global domination in the post-World War II period. Who are those people? Who are Byron Engel, August Vollmer, Orlando Wilson, and Robert Comer, who comes into play later on? And how did they shape American policing?
Yeah, well, if you were to go to the shelf that has books about the history of policing in the United States, even textbooks that are used in teaching police officers today, I think you would be quite likely to see August Vollmer mentioned. You'd be pretty likely to see Orlando Wilson mentioned. You would be unlikely, I think, to see Byron Engel mentioned, although maybe after my book, he will get a little bit more attention. August Vollmer was hugely important. He was a police officer in Berkeley, California, who developed a kind of national and international reputation for police reform, played a part in the creation. He was really the most important person in the creation of the first higher education program for police, which was at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. He played a role in the Wickersham Commission, which was a federal body that investigated the problems of policing. The Obama administration was not the first presidential administration to wonder, how can we fix the problems of policing? And in fact, many of the arguments that folks made, to Obama, August Vollmer would have made in the 1920s or 30s. So he's hugely important, hugely influential. He has a role in the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is a body that I pay some attention to in the book. Orlando Wilson is his most prized student so Vollmer, introduces a bunch of reforms in Berkeley, but then eventually he becomes a kind of consultant. He both has this educational apparatus at the university in Berkeley, but he also is traveling around the country and around the globe. You know, LA, Cuba. You know, he has a bunch of students from China come to Berkeley who then go back to China. So he, to the extent that anybody who knows the history of policing in the United States knows that Vollmer is a larger than life figure, they may pay less attention to his kind of international connections. And it's also important to mention, and there's really important and fantastic new work on this by the sociologist Julian Go, about how Vollmer, but also many other people of his generation, were veterans of the Philippine counterinsurgency effort in the kind of immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War. So that shaped how they policed parts of the United States. So Wilson's Vollmer's most prized student, and he travels around the country. He's the police executive in a couple places. Ultimately, Chicago is the last city and the biggest city that he operates in. He's brought in after some scandals in Chicago. And he basically retires from being in charge of the police in Chicago toward the end of the 60s, really frustrated, demoralized, basically that this was supposed to be the capstone to his career as a police reformer. And he's basically stymied by endemic corruption, malfeasance, and also the political machine in Chicago. So if there's a kind of first generation of police reformers, it's the Vollmer generation. The second generation would be the Wilson generation, and then subsequent generations come next. So Engel is, he's a little bit younger than Wilson, but he's very much in that generation of people for whom Wilson is the kind of leading dominant figure in terms of police reform, and the term I use, which is the term that the police themselves would use, professionalization. Professionalization means a few things. Most importantly, for folks like Vollmer and Wilson, it means getting rid of political corruption. Political corruption in the sense that police worked on behalf of political officials in various cities, right? That they were not simply, law enforcement, they were kind of political enforcers, all the way to the level of interfering with elections and so forth. So these leaders wanted to eradicate that type of corruption from policing. I think on the whole, they were fairly successful in that endeavor. Corruption obviously does not go away in policing, but it shifts character. I think that type of corruption is largely eliminated in most places. They also, so professionalization means turning police into a profession with an identity of its own, separate from its identity as a kind of political tool for the machines that run the cities. But it also means upgrading the status, the education, the compensation, the skills and technologies of police departments. So that's what Wilson works really hard to do, and that is what Engel takes from him. So, okay, who is Byron Engel, and why do I focus so much on him? And I should just say that Byron Engel is a little bit of a mystery. And he's a figure who's known, but he did not leave behind papers. He did not leave behind a memoir. I was in touch briefly with family members of his. They were a little skeptical of my interest in him and didn't really actually know very much about him. I think that he was well known in certain circles, but he was not self-aggrandizing in the way that some officials who play important roles in any kind of political or international history, they want to leave behind a legacy and they want everybody to know what they did. Engel was not that type of person. So it was not really easy for me to figure out what he did. For example, somebody who I mentioned in the book, Edward Lansdale, CIA guy, counterinsurgency expert, he left behind his papers. He wanted people to know what he did. He wrote a kind of self-aggrandizing autobiography. There's nothing comparable for Engel. But, he did write a lot of words in the course of his career. They weren't necessarily so much about himself, but they were about what he did. And so I tried to follow that. But I was able to piece together a bit of his biography, and he became a police officer in Kansas City at the end of the 1930s, when Kansas City had a huge reform program introduced because it was a very corrupt city with a very powerful political boss. Political boss gets pushed out, sent to prison. New police chief comes in. The new police chief is a close student and acolyte of J. Edgar Hoover. He hires a whole bunch of new officers, and Engel is one of them. Engel stands out for whatever reason. He's this kind of policing prodigy, and he quickly moves up the ranks. World War II happens, and Engel stays home. Many cops go overseas during World War II, but Engel does not, and he continues to ascend in the ranks and goes to the FBI school. He also, at some point, takes a kind of management class at some class on how to be a better boss, basically. So he clearly has some ambitions. The war ends, and Orlando Wilson is in Germany, reforming, being in charge of the reform of the police in Germany. And again, as with Vollmer, the point here is to say, everybody knows about Orlando Wilson to some extent. Few people know that he played a prominent role in rebuilding and refashioning the police in Germany. So it's a little bit hard to know exactly what happened, how it happened. I haven't found a document, it might exist somewhere, but I never found it, that explicitly says like who picked up the phone and made the call or whatever technology they used, sent the letter, whatever it was at the time, that said, hey, let's send this guy Byron Engel to Japan. But basically, Byron Engel, most likely because Orlando Wilson knew who he was, is recommended to go to Japan and do what Wilson had been doing in Germany in Japan, meaning reform the police, professionalize the police, take away the political influence. And this is the key point. Wilson, Engel, others of their generation have all come through a period where the political control of the police in many cities of the United States is broken, and police are professionalizing, turned into this somewhat more independent instrument. Now, we could talk about what that independence actually means. They're not independent from the forces of, capital or industry or whatever, but they are independent from political parties for the most part. Then, now it's a different question. And so they go over to these other countries where they say, okay, look, this has been an authoritarian, totalitarian, awful regime. The police were a crucial piece of that regime. They were totally controlled. Hitler controlled the police at the lowest level in Germany. Now, whether that's an accurate assessment of what was going on is not for me to discern. However, that is how these US policing experts looked at it. And so they said, aha, we broke the political control of police in Kansas City. We can break the political control of the police in this defeated regime in Germany or in Japan. And we can introduce American-style policing. And that's what they tried to do. Decentralized, of course, in the United States, the White House does not control police. In many cases, City Hall doesn't even control police. Police are fairly autonomous, and there's many different police forces, sometimes with overlapping jurisdiction. So in Germany and Japan, the idea is to try to create this decentralized system of policing with one important caveat, which is that its purpose is not just to maintain quote unquote law and order. Its purpose is to prevent the rise of a communist power in these places, right? Now, it's important to note that the risk of, say, Japan or Germany or Korea becoming controlled by communists, I think, is something that historians continue to debate. And at different moments, say like January 1946 versus January 1950 or whatever, it changes. But nevertheless, the United States, through these figures like Engel, wants to make sure that the police forces that it's building are going to be able to prevent communists from taking power. And this piece, of course, shapes what comes in the subsequent decades as the Cold War gets more and more intense. And as the Cold War, I wouldn't say shifts, because I think that the quote unquote third world is always in the picture. But there's questions about Europe that are basically settled, I think, by the early 60s. Questions about what's going to happen in the rest of the world are never settled through to the putative end of the Cold War. And so U.S. police assistance is an essential instrument of fighting the Cold War for the U.S.
Right. And you mentioned specifically the true purpose of police, actually. is it really the crime prevention or is it something else? We'll actually come back to it in the later part. My next question is about OPS, the Office of Public Safety, where you actually sacrifice a large part to discuss it really extensively.
Yeah.
Because it was, I guess, central to all these strategies and these tactics that you are talking about. What was Office of Public Safety? We know from your book that OPS, Office of Public Safety, designs and executes assistance programs to these third world countries. My secondary question is, at what bureaucratic and strategic points do OPS and police connect? And for what purpose actually do they collaborate? And finally, how do these strategies play out from the race relations perspective?
Yeah, good question. So the Office of Public Safety is ultimately what Engel goes on to direct. So he goes to Japan at the end of World War II in 1946 and leaves Kansas City and basically never goes home again. He becomes a kind of international figure. He's working for the CIA, he's working for the Army, and in and he's doing this police assistance work after 1954, becoming more institutionalized. Other figures, again, of the Wilson generation, Wilson publishes textbooks, right? If you look at the textbooks he writes, and you look at, sometimes there are co-authors listed, you look on the first page where it says, thank you to so-and-so who helped me write this textbook. You look at that list of names, well, in that list of names are people who Engel is working alongside in the 1950s in providing police assistance in other countries. So in 1954, end of 1954, the Eisenhower administration kind of formalizes police assistance to some degree, but it still is not really codified by having a central office to run it. The Office of Public Safety is that. So Engel is behind the scenes doing this work. In 1962, the Kennedy administration, largely at the prodding of Robert Comer, who is in the National Security Council, creates the Office of Public Safety, puts Engel in charge of it. He's already basically in charge of this work, but he doesn't have the kind of formal title, and the Office of Public Safety is the kind of formal bureaucratic system for it. And there's just one or two key details here. So the Office of Public Safety is lodged in the Agency for International Development, which is the kind of new creation of the Kennedy administration to prod modernization and development in its own conceptualization across the third world. And so OPS is part of a development agency. Its mission is to develop and modernize police forces. However, Engel, the leaders of the Agency for International Development will get called before Congress and have to talk about what OPS is doing, but Engel doesn't answer to them. I think they were quite frustrated by that at all points, because they couldn't control OPS. OPS really answers to the National Security Council, to Comer for some time, and Comer, is a figure who is, he becomes super important in the US war in Vietnam, but even before that, he has a really close relationship with both Kennedy and Johnson. And it's notable that a lot of figures did not maintain close relations with both of them, but Comer did. So, Engel can pick up the phone and talk to Comer fairly easily, and Comer can wander into the Oval Office fairly easily. So it's a pretty close relationship. CIA, of course, is very powerful in the kind of background of all of this. And OPS, therefore, has a kind of budget line that is not reducible to what the Agency for International Development wants its budget line to be. And I think that's just a really kind of crucial detail. So to answer your question, this gives the OPS a kind of it's a small operation. It's a really small operation. It peaks at a few hundred advisors. In many countries, it sends maybe 2 advisors. So it operates in 52 countries. It operates over the course of its existence from 1962 to 1974-75. It operates 2 academies, one in the Panama Canal Zone called the Inter-American Police Academy, which operated from 62 to 64, pretty brief window. And then that was subsumed into the much larger International Police Academy, which operated in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., in a building called the Car Barn, which is still there and now used by Georgetown University. And so the International Police Academy brings officers from around the globe to be trained. Ultimately, 77 countries send officers to it. So OPS operates overseas in 52 countries, and then 77 countries send their officers to be trained at the IPA. And this, and there's other pieces to it, but this is where the interaction between the U.S. foreign policy goals and police happens and becomes quite intimate. And in fact, I'm still kind of learning things, and it's like I've written this book, but I still learn things about this. So I just stumbled across, in some new research I'm doing, I stumbled across this newsletter of the Baltimore Police Department, and it has a little article. It's a newsletter that all the police in Baltimore would have received, every couple of weeks or whatever. So it has little news articles that are about the department, about what's going on in the city. Most of them are not that interesting. Births, deaths, just like regular kind of info for employees of the police department. And there's an article that says police from Thailand, Vietnam, etc., visited the Baltimore Police Department this month. They rode around in squad cars. They visited headquarters. They spoke to this person. They went to the academy. They spoke to that person. They were brought here by the Office of Public Safety of the Agency for International Development as part of their training at the International Police Academy, right? So this is where you can see the creation of this fraternity among police that is a global fraternity. Many of the officers, if not all of the officers that were brought to the United States for training were high-ranking officers. And this created some weird frictions because at the IPA, there was a very advanced, in terms of technology, firing range because OPS thought it was absolutely crucial for all police officers to have excellent marksmanship skills. And you have these officers who are based, some of them are, they're like the equivalent of J. Edgar Hoover in their own country. They're basically bureaucrats who sit at desks, answer memos, issue commands. They're not out in the streets, firing their weapons. And yet, they come to the IPA and they're forced to undergo marksmanship training. Now, some of them probably enjoyed it and found it to be quite fun, but some of them were like, this is not what I thought I signed up for. Right? So, this is where you get the kind of intersection of these scales, the policing at the kind of local scale in the United States with this kind of global scale ambition of the US kind of national security apparatus. And really it's about creating this intimate set of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you. And I would say, talking about OPS and the empowerment of police and expanding its powers globally, I would say it is also important to mention LEA, Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the funding part, which is, I guess, one of the strengths of your book. We know that LEA channeled federal funds to law enforcement and arguably, this is my argument, paved the way for the famous 1033 program. At least it could be an example, it could be a historical reference to it. So 1033 program provided police forces with $500 million worth of unused military equipment to be used in drug enforcement or other purposes, for other purposes. What is the importance of bureaucratic efforts like LEA in empowering police forces to understand the professionalization and independence of police?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Law Enforcement Assistance Administration is created in 1968 with the Omnibus Safe Streets and Crime Control Act that Lyndon Johnson signs. It kind of builds on an already existing but much, much smaller effort called the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance. And it's just like when you look at these operations, term Office of Public Safety, Office of Law Enforcement Assistance, I shouldn't say when I looked at them, I was like, interesting. They have similar names. They seem to be doing similar things in the sense that OPS overseas is distributing resources, advanced technology, training, trying to upgrade police around the globe. The LEAA, according to the design of the Safe Streets Act, is doing something very, very similar. It's trying to upgrade, provide resources to enhance policing and law enforcement, and also transfer technologies within the United States. And it turns out that this very close friend of Byron Engels, who I focus on in the book, Arnold Saglin, he, even before the creation of the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance, before the so-called, declaration of a war on crime by Johnson. He looks at what's going on in the United States in 1964, the summer of 1964, civil rights protests, uprisings in Harlem, Philadelphia, Chicago, and a few other places, Rochester. He says, these uprisings are happening because, in part, the police are ill-equipped to deal with them. He says, he doesn't put it exactly this way, but he says, my close buddy, Byron Engel, is doing the type of work overseas that we need to do domestic. We need to upgrade the capabilities of police forces to control, unrest, riots, and so forth. We need to use the power of the purse of Washington to help under-resourced, under-trained, under-equipped police in the United States. We are doing this overseas already with the Office of Public Safety. He says that's almost a verbatim quote. We're already doing this overseas with the Office of Public Safety. Let's just do the same thing in the United States. Now, there's basically, so that's 1964. So there's a 4-year gap between when Saglin says this and the bill is signed in 1968. But what the bill ultimately comes to do is exactly what he proposes. Now, there's all kinds of wrangling in between. There's also presidential commissions that do investigations and so forth. But ultimately, as I say in the book, the LEAA is the domestic analog of the Office of Public Safety. Now, it doesn't have exactly, the same purpose, although I think historians are engaged in a debate about the efficacy and effectiveness of the LEAA, how crucial it was to ultimately the building of the carceral state, how crucial it was to political repression of social movements of the 1960s and 70s. I think it probably deserves more credit than it gets. I think, the FBI gets a ton of credit, deservedly so. The LEA at the time was assumed, by activists and journalists, was assumed to be really nefarious. I think that notion that it was really nefarious has dissipated subsequently in the decades. But then I think now, as people are looking more closely into it again, among, historians and so forth, I think people are starting to realize, it actually was pretty nefarious. What does it do? Well, for example, today, ubiquitous in cities of the United States are police helicopters. The police helicopter pre-exists the LEAA, but it becomes ubiquitous because of the LEAA. For example, again, Baltimore, I'm researching Baltimore right now. Baltimore does not have a police helicopter system program until the LEAA helps it produce one, create one. And this is true in many other cities. Now, the use of helicopters for patrol and other police operations is 100% informed by the experience of the US military in using helicopters in Southeast Asia. There's just no question. It happens at the same time, and the expertise is just wholesale transferred to the United States. Technologies are transferred, and the LEAA helps them to become so there's many other examples along these lines. One that I mentioned in the book is walkie-talkies. OPS designs a walkie-talkie that is cheap and durable for distribution in, again, in its 8 recipient countries. And this type of walkie-talkie becomes ubiquitous in the United States. And I think the interesting thing just to point out is that insofar as the United States, officials had this idea that 8 recipient countries were underdeveloped, needed US help and resources. Well, the fact is that police forces in the United States were also underdeveloped, had inadequate resources. They're not that different in terms of their access to technology from, police forces in far off lands, right? Particularly rural areas of the United States. So, and just maybe to kind of lead back to your point about the 1033 program, the LEAA also is very active because it comes online in the moment of the US war in Vietnam and then the drawdown of the war effort. Is very active in trying to find ways to transfer surplus military gear to police officers. Now, that isn't even necessarily the very first episode of that, but it's an important episode that I think does set the tone for what comes later in the 1990s.
Absolutely. In a Jacobin magazine interview with Jana Walters, I believe, you categorize American policing into 3 periods: partisan, professional, and profiteering. But you may put an emphasis on profiteering. Could you briefly explain those eras? Partisan, professional, profiteering. What do they mean for American policing?
Yeah. Well, so we've talked about the partisan era. This is the era that, Vollmer and Wilson are trying to put an end to. I think, again, they largely succeed and inaugurate the professional era, which really goes through the 1970s, begins in the 30s, 40s, 50s, goes into the 70s. And then the next era, I don't know if profiteering is exactly the right term because, I want to be clear that the way that a capitalist firm profits is not exactly the same as the way that a government agency profits, because a government agency doesn't profit. It gathers revenue, which is not profit. However, I'm using that term to kind of highlight this almost obsessive focus on enhancing budgets that has, I think, defined the period from the 70s to the present. In some sense, the phrase defund the police, which has become a mobilizing demand, particularly in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in 2020, that phrase doesn't really make sense outside the context of this shift from the 70s to the present, where police have tried to garner such large shares of government expenditures, right? So governments like taxes have other revenue streams, and they've been funneling them to police departments. And in many places, the share that, goes to police keeps going up and up and up and up. The expenditures on policing keep going up and up and up and up. And police fight really hard to make sure that remains true. Whereas the share of revenues on other government services has remained static. So in Baltimore, again, to use this example, basically 50% of the municipal budget every year goes to the Baltimore Police Department, and the total expenditure, what that 50% represents, has been going up and up and up. My colleague Lester Spence always points out that, he's lived in Baltimore a lot longer than I have. The portion that goes to Parks and Rec has remained very small and has not changed at all, as the portion going to the police force, both the percentage has grown and the absolute amount has grown. Parks and Rec has not grown. So this is what I mean by highlighting the term, using the term profiteering. I think there's also another key point, which is that there are a lot of technology and equipment companies that have made a lot of money in the process. Because when cops say they want their budget to be increased, well, what is the budget going to be used on? On the one hand, it's going to be used on their compensation, their pension, and so forth. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. But it's also going to be used on new technologies, whether they are quote unquote reform technologies like body cameras, or they're helicopters, or they are weapons and body armor and so forth. And this is where, again, the feds figure importantly, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of Defense, and so forth, because they have huge amounts of resources at their disposal. Cities have limited amounts of resources. Even big cities with big budgets, they still rely on outside grants and other revenue streams to get some of the equipment for the police that they need.
Absolutely. And I remember the part when you wrote about, well, actually you spoke about in the podcast, where different manufacturers emerged thanks to the need of CS gas, right? Or weapon manufacturers thanks to this sort of one strategic move for one purpose. Maybe that could be also considered as profiteering, not only for police departments and expanding their powers, but also for certain enterprises to just make money out of it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should say that, the Office of Public Safety, plays a role in this insofar as it is very focused on up-to-date technology. And yeah, Byron Engel and Arnold Saglan, again, have a role in the adoption of CS as the kind of tear gas, quote unquote, tear gas of choice in the United States, as well as its adoption, of course, around the globe. And there's a story that didn't make it into the book, but that I maybe you're referring to, that I often repeat, which is that OPS sends some tear gas to Brazil, says, check it out, you might find this useful. And Brazilian law enforcement authorities are like, oh yeah, this stuff's great, but we don't want to buy it from the United States. The United States is not going to give us enough for our needs. It's not charity, right? So, and we don't want to spend the money to buy it ourselves, but, we're really happy that you introduced us to this technology. So we are going to build our own tear gas factory in Brazil. And, decades later, Brazil is one of the primary providers of tear gas around the globe. That initial kind of catalyzing that kind of domestic tear gas industry, I think, is a little bit hard to imagine without the work of the Office of Public Safety. Now, does the Office of Public Safety, how do we assess that? Like what on a kind of theoretical and conceptual level, like how do we make sense of that prod of the domestic tear gas and then ultimately, international tear gas industry? I think it raises, really interesting and complicated questions that I think we're still kind of making sense of and thinking through. But, to the extent that my work can help us to focus on these questions, and again, to think of them as not merely questions that we can answer by looking at only the domestic sphere or only the international sphere, but thinking them together as one kind of interlinked and whole area that we have to understand as unified. I think that if I can convince people of the necessity of that, then my work will have succeeded.
So you refer to, well, you directly quote August Vollmer saying that, "For years, ever since Spanish-American War days, I've studied military tactics and used them to good effect in rounding up crooks. After all, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society, and we must never forget that." And he's saying that, as you say, to the LAPD officers. Are police in a kind of war with the society? What's going on?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's a very, resonant quote. I was quite excited when I found it from Vollmer. He's not the only person to use the kind of war metaphor, and it goes in some ways, it goes back even farther. And again, Mark Neoclaus, who you mentioned, as a theorist of some of this stuff, he's done some great work showing how policing is an act of social war, because the social war of the class war is the kind of fundamental defining characteristic of capitalism over the centuries, and police are at the center of it. And I'm on board with that theoretical perspective, and I think that there's great value in highlighting the relationship, and this is what my work in many ways is about, of war making and policing at a kind of empirical level. However, I would say that figures like Engel, even when he's seconded to the U.S. Army in the 1950s, he's quite convinced that the police need to remain a civilian body, and that is in part because he has an understanding of the distinction between military and civilian that I think is held tightly in the United States, even as it is kind of non-existent in the United States. There's a really strong ideological belief in this distinction, even as we kind of look out the window and find that it's not really there, right? He, therefore, with the Office of Public Safety, holds on to this ideological distinction, but he also, for bureaucratic reasons, has to hold on to a distinction between civilian and military, because if he collapses the two, he's at risk of being put out of work, right? If the Department of Defense, which has a much greater budget, much more political power than he does, the Department of Defense takes over the police training mission because there's no difference between police and military. He's out of work. His advisors are out of work. So there are practical material reasons for him to hold up this ideological distinction, even as what the Office of Public Safety does, I think we could understand within the rubric of militarizing police. They introduce more military style technologies, and they'll say, oh well, with that delivery of M16s or that delivery of grenades, maybe don't put the OPS logo on the box because we don't really want people to know that it's coming from OPS, right? So I mean, there's a lot of interesting memos like that in the records that I found. So they are doing this work of what I think we would understand as militarizing, and they will engage in the use of this type of metaphor of making a war on criminals, a war on communist subversives, and so forth. But they don't necessarily think that the way you defeat a communist insurgency is by, just slaughtering everybody. Now, of course, slaughtering everybody is what exists or what occurs in many places. And this is one of the kind of fundamental tensions and kind of contradictions and paradoxes that I try to explore in the book, which is, why is it that police assistance is designed to prevent the massacres of peasants or whatever, women and children in the countryside, that it's thought the military is typically going to be doing? And why is it that it ends up happening nonetheless, despite the self-conception of these police advisors that they're doing something different from the military. So I try to explore that in the book, and in some ways it's a tension that's quite challenging to resolve, because they never they never, well, not never, but rarely, admit to what's actually happening. But I think it just kind of gets us back to where we started this line of inquiry, with the way of thinking of people like Vollmer, which is that they are engaged in a war, right? So it's like, if you're engaged in a war, no matter how much you protest that what you're doing is enhancing civilian security capacities, introducing non-lethal weapons like CS, if you're engaged in a war, well, what happens in war? People get killed. And I think there's no way out of that. The liberals in the foreign service, in the national security bureaucracy, oftentimes are convinced by the more conservative or cynical operators who say we have to assure security first and foremost. We have to provide police assistance. We have to provide military assistance. We have to eradicate the communist threat. And the liberals say, yeah, you're right, we got to do that. And then after we eradicate the communist threat, then we'll introduce, literacy programs, health programs, agricultural yield enhancing programs, so on and so forth. And then when the peasants who are supposed to, have improved agricultural yield get massacred, the liberals are like, wait, what? Why did this happen? I did not sign on for this. Because I think on the one hand, they're a little bit naive about the fact of this war, this social war, class war. And on the other hand, I think that they are also really convinced that the communist threat or the nationalist, the independence threat is so powerful that it can't be ignored, and something has to be done about it to provide the foundation of stability and security for development to occur. And arguably development is actually stymied by the introduction of these security measures. And so you end up having in the historical archive, you have records of many liberal foreign service folks who come away greatly disappointed in what they did in their career, because they thought they were going to Guatemala to improve the literacy and life expectancy, and they did the opposite, because they were convinced that police assistance against the communist threat, military assistance against the communist threat had to come first. And what you get as a result is massacres and so forth. But you're not going to find in the records of the Office of Public Safety any document that says the purpose of police assistance is to massacre peasants. That document doesn't exist. I mean, maybe it existed and somebody tore it up, but it doesn't exist now. So how do we, part of what I try to do in the book is show, well, in the absence of that evidence, that somebody in OPS said, all right, let's teach cops how to kill peasants, how do we explain that it still happened nonetheless?
Mm-hmm. Well, also when we study the history of the United States, we never see a page about just going to the New World means burning the libraries of the Central Americans like Aztecs and so on, right? Or Mayans. So yeah, we'll never find the evidence about it.
And that doesn't mean it didn't occur. That's the problem. Is so much history has followed the archive to say, like, well, maybe the claims of these peasants that there was a massacre are untrue. And it's like, no, we know they're true. How do we explain the U.S. role in them when we can't find a document in the U.S. archive? I mean, of course, there are some documents to be found, but on the whole, people are quite cautious about what they put down, right? Yeah. So how do we make sense of it then?
Yeah, right. Moving a little forward, one of the most notable moments, I guess, in moments of shift from crime prevention to riot control was the Watts riots of 1965 that you also talk about in the beginning of your 8th chapter, I guess. We also witnessed the recent example of the protests following the killing of George Floyd, when National Guards were deployed to suppress the protests. Have protests become a national safety issue that National Guards were deployed?
You mean today?
Right.
Well, it's interesting because I think on the one hand, people on the far left will argue that the willingness of regular folks, relatively not politically organized folks, to engage in pitched battles with police is a notable phenomenon, is a somewhat new phenomenon. I think we also would say it's an international phenomenon. It's not only in the United States. And I think protesters in the United States, if anything, in terms of their protest tactics, are somewhat behind other places around the globe where protesters have been much more aggressive, but also sophisticated in their tactics. I would just mention, perhaps I think it's always a little bit important to keep in mind that police, even in countries that receive a lot of aid from the United States, are not nearly as heavily armed as police in the United States. And I think, that changes the dynamic a little bit. I mean, I think that people in the United States have been afraid of police because of their fears that police are trigger happy. The sad fact in other countries is that even if they're not necessarily as heavily armed, they are killing protesters, whereas protesters aren't getting killed in the United States by police. I mean, there's always an incident here or there, but on the whole, you're not seeing protesters getting shot down in the streets in the United States by bullets. Now, they might be getting shot with rubber bullets or tear gas canisters, and they might suffer grievous injuries. But this is the legacy of Byron Engel and Arnold Sagwin, that protesters don't actually get shot down in the streets in the United States, as they did in 1965 in Watts, in 1967 in Detroit, and so forth, right? So there was a shift. Now the shift looks like the use of a lot more tear gas and other so-called non-lethal technologies. Today there's sound cannons and other types of technologies like that, which again can cause grievous injuries. So on the one hand, yeah, I think people on the left want to kind of hype the threat to national security that protests are producing. So do people on the right. I'm not saying that we need to take some kind of centrist position between the two, but I think it is worthwhile to kind of assess, and people were asking me. I had friends sending me text messages last summer that was like, is this a revolution? Is this the fall of the United States? And I was like, look, this is like, it might feel basically as close as we've gotten to a revolutionary situation since, say 1968, but no, this is not a revolutionary situation. In that way, I'm perhaps in agreement with, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but I think it's important to note that the kind of unrest, protest, even pitched battles among protesters and police officers in various places, particularly Portland, did not rise to the level of risking the destabilization and overthrow of the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. From summer of 2020 to January 6th is a totally different situation where an even more focused attempt did occur, ostensibly to try to overthrow the at least congressional authority in the United States. Did that come close to succeeding? I'm hesitant to say yes. However, I also think it was an extremely dangerous and it was tantamount to insurrection, but it was supported by the president. So it's a complicated, I think we lack some terminology even to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. All of this is to say that the national security risk of protest is small if we accept national security on its own terms. The national security risk of COVID, the national security risk of climate change induced heat waves and wildfires and so forth is grave. Hundreds of thousands of people have died from COVID in the United States, as millions of people are dying around the globe. This is a national security threat. The Trump administration ignored the threat of COVID, or downplayed it, completely mismanaged it, and yet we're sort of told that some protesters hanging out outside the White House and chanting Black Lives Matter is a national security threat that requires the introduction of a National Guard, use of chemical munitions, the low level flying helicopters engaging in offensive maneuvers, all of that. So I think that we really need to have a broader perspective on what is national security on its own terms? Is the national security apparatus doing what it claims to be doing, which is keeping Americans safe? What are police doing? Are police keeping Americans safe? And so on and so forth. I think that these types of questions are what people are asking and should be asking. And it just kind of brings us back to the question of the expenditure of resources. In Baltimore City, should 50% of municipal budget be going to the BPD when there are grave other it's not to say that there isn't a serious homicide problem in Baltimore City. Is BPD doing anything about the homicide problem? Not that I can tell. More than half of homicides go unsolved. And poverty, hunger, infant mortality, these are all off the charts in certain neighborhoods in Baltimore. So what's being secured? And this gets us back to the question of what fundamentally is police about, and the theoretical perspectives of people who like Neoclass who we've already invoked. Well, what is being secured is capital accumulation, and a racial order, which you put on the table, which I think is absolutely crucial to understand this whole picture. And that's something that I try to weave throughout the text of Badges Without Borders, is to show that the fabrication of a capitalist social order and the fabrication of a racial order on a global scale, and the foreign and domestic nodes of it, again, are intertwined. We need to understand that when we talk about policing, when we talk about national security.
Oh, thank you. Wow, you answered the following two questions of mine, so thank you. That saved a lot of time, but thank you. I was going to ask about the empowerment as a means of fabricating order. Then I was going to ask about the nucleus part, about fabricating order as a means of maintaining order.
And there certainly is, a lot more to be said. And again, I've learned so much from those types of theoretical works. I think that there's value in moving from the kind of level of political theory to the level of kind of empirical historical research, and that's not to say that historical research has any kind of monopoly on empirical work. Of course, there can be ethnography, other kinds of geographical work. I think it's really crucial to understand the kind of spatial operations of policing in cities and so forth. But I guess I would just say that it can be a real challenge to bring together the empirical work with the theoretical principles. I try to do it to the best of my ability, and I know others do as well. I think to the degree that we fail, it doesn't mean that one is the right approach or the other is the right approach. It's just a real kind of theoretical, methodological thicket to figure out how to bring them all together. And our work is made richer for trying to overcome that, but it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. But I would also agree that it's absolutely crucial, and I was rather excited and fascinated when I saw Nucleus quote in your book, and oh god, that would be a great match. So my next question is about alternatives. So we talked about the problems, we talked about professionalization, the history, and the current situation, and all the problems and the problematic issues about police. You mentioned in your article More Than Cosmetic Changes a figure called Victor Cizanckas, who was a police, I would say, chief in Menlo Park, California. Who was Victor Cizanckas, and what did he try to accomplish in California?
Yeah. So maybe before I speak about Cizanckas, I would just maybe say one or two things about alternatives. I think that first of all, today in the contemporary moment, there are efforts to create alternatives to policing as it exists. Even in nearby where I am right now in Baltimore City, this is happening. There's organizations like Safe Streets, there are violence interrupters. There are really grassroots groups putting in the very difficult work to find ways to solve social problems of interpersonal violence without reliance on police. What's fascinating to learn is that in Baltimore City, the BPD actually doesn't like these programs and to some degree interferes with them.
Wow.
There's also been a kind of horrific reality, which is in 2021, two people who work for Safe Streets have been murdered. So it's a complicated and somewhat sad situation, because these are the least resourced people with the hardest jobs, who are also, they're perhaps being targeted by people who, these incidents are unsolved, so we don't know who did it, I think, last I heard. But, we also know that the police harass them and have created real challenges for them. So, I think the kind of like liberal understanding would be like the police would love to have some help, but it turns out that that's not actually the case, at least here. In other cities, there's a new pilot program in New York of trying to create kind of quote unquote first responders who aren't police. And the initial evidence seems to suggest that it's working fairly well. I think there's a lot of energy for trying these things out, but the models. On the one hand, we kind of have a sense of what the models look like, but I think there's a lot more experimentation to be done. There's a lot more kind of codification of the models to be done, and there's a lot more resources that need to be dedicated to it. So that's the kind of grassroots version of creating alternatives. I looked at this guy, Victor Cizanckas, because it was kind of oddity in my research that I came across, which was that, one thing I knew or that I learned was that, again, to go back to the LEAA and the kind of initial push at the end of the 60s to create SWAT teams and to endow police forces with sophisticated, riot control technologies. This was happening even in very small and wealthy towns across the United States, including in California. So Menlo Park today is an extremely wealthy town because it's where the Silicon Valley tech boom, occurred. In the 1960s and early 1970s, some of that boom had already started to occur, but it was not the super rich, place that it is today. And this police chief, Victor Cizanckas, was hired, and he had this idea that, look, there are frictions between the local community and the police department here, and maybe we can solve them by changing the police department. And he wanted to, in his understanding, demilitarize policing. And I think this kind of gets back to something that I didn't say earlier, but which is just that, Orlando Wilson, for example, would have understood the professionalizing reforms that he introduced for police as militarizing, in a sense, because what he thought is that police should, wear military style uniforms, they should undergo military style training, they should be subject to firm and strict forms of discipline, there should be a firm and strict rank hierarchy. All of these are on the model of the military for police. So when Cizanckas says he wants to demilitarize, so on the one hand, it's happening in a moment when police are becoming more militarized. Again, like I said, the adoption of helicopters, the adoption of heavy armaments, and he wants to have both reject that type of technological militarization, but also reject some of the kind of internal forms of militarization in terms of the rank structure and so forth. And the most famous thing that he does is try to get rid of police uniforms, that what he sees as too military militarized uniforms, just what everyday cops wear. So he introduces these quote unquote mod uniforms with blazers. He lets cops kind of grow their hair long, lets them have beards. And he thinks that, so he tries to do away with titles like sergeant, lieutenant, and so forth.
Right.
He wants them to have kind of functional titles. So it's like your title would be, something like
traffic officer.
Exactly. Yeah. It would describe what your role is.
Mm-hmm.
So he really tries to change the Menlo Park Police Department, and it's a really interesting. He's progressive politically. I think we would consider him a fairly committed anti-racist, but he's a police officer, and he's committed to improving policing, not doing away with policing, which I think is the kind of difference between the grassroots models that I mentioned earlier that are happening on the ground in the United States now. Which really they want to shrink the footprint of policing and fill that quote unquote vacuum with grassroots groups and institutions and operations. Cizanckas is not necessarily trying to do the same thing. He's just trying to make it so that police will be more effective, have better relations with the community, and his understanding by being less kind of hierarchical, less overtly armed. So like they wear blazers and they hide their weapons. If they carry a pistol, it's under their blazer, rather than the traditional version, which is that a police officer wears his or her gun on the hip in a visible way. So it's these types of changes. So what ends up happening? Well, he succeeds on some level. He does change the department. He becomes a figure of national prominence because it's very interesting, these reforms he's trying to introduce. But they're fairly unpopular locally, which is really the interesting part. So I think something like a third of the police force quits. They say, I don't want to wear a blazer and grow a beard. I want to keep wearing my traditional police uniform. I want to still be called lieutenant. I don't want to be called, traffic officer or whatever. So a bunch of them quit and go to probably other police forces in the nearby area where this isn't the case. But also the right, the far right, conservatives in the area reject this as well. And some of them engage in these really outrageous tactics to try to force the police to remilitarize. So they start planting bombs and antagonizing the police to try to prove that this demilitarization effort is not the right path. In fact, the police need to be militarized because there are going to be bombs blowing up in little Menlo Park, this small affluent town in the in the south of San Francisco in the Bay Area. So there's both internal resistance among the police, and then there's external resistance from political operators, and then and various other factions as well. So ultimately, Cizanckas leaves the Bay Area. He again, he has this national prominence. He goes to Stamford, Connecticut, which was a notoriously corrupt police force, which had a lot of suspected mafia connections and documented mafia connections. And then he dies young of a heart attack. There's no foul play suspected. I have no idea what happened, but he dies young, and so he would be old today. But if he had lived, he may have had a more prominent reputation that lasted into the 80s and 90s, but he died pretty young, and so he was basically forgotten. But I felt like it was an interesting enough story that it was worth an article, and I really, for myself, I wanted to figure out, well, who was this guy? What did he do? What happened? The research was pretty interesting. It's separate from Badges Without Borders, but of course deals with some similar themes as what's in the book. So that was in the Journal of Urban History. I think it was published. It was actually technically published in 2020, but it was available, I think, as early as 2017, kind of online as a preview version. So yeah, thanks for asking me about that article. I'm not sure if anybody ever read it. So at least one person read it. I know now.
I read it twice. Right. Sure. So this brings us to our last question, my last question to you. So if you can maybe observe from my environment that I really like this streaming and gaming sort of setup, and I'm a really hard gamer, so, and I'm really interested in science fiction as a genre, and one of the latest examples of that science fiction video game genre is Cyberpunk 2077. When I was doing the MA degree, I was taking a class titled Science Fiction in the United States, and with a super interesting and really proficient professor called Pavel Fralik. And in the science fiction classes, we generally argue that the science fiction stories which take place in the future is to certain degrees reflection of now, which includes everything, politics, environment, everything. Mm-hmm. So when I was playing Cyberpunk 2077, I watched a really interesting scene. So it's like a transitional scene that you start a mission, then it kind of takes you through, some scenes that you need to understand the mission and so on. So I'm gonna show you a short scene, something like 20 second, 25 second scene, where, let's say, the future version of SWATs are responding to a situation, to a case. And after that, I'm going to ask you a question about the future of police and what you think about it. Sure. So
your average badges. That's Max Tac. NCPD's apex predators. MTAC rolls in when things fly out of hand. Gonks out there, though. Just a midday snack for them. Well, show's over. Poor bastards. They had it coming.
So, well, what do you think? Do you think the future of police departments will look like this, with SWATs having this Max Tac sort of identity and look?
Well, I'm hesitant to predict the future, but I think it's more likely than not that there will be some aspects like that. I think we already know that the interest in drones, the interest in kind of robot technologies, the robot dog, various other types of robots is intense. There's a lot of capital invested in these types of technologies. So, on the one hand, going along with what you said, how do we interpret this kind of text? Is it about the present? I think absolutely it is. It's about a fantasy of dominance. It's about a fantasy of kind of technological acumen and success, and it's even about it's almost like an investment perspective. So it's like if we're willing to put the money into the robot dog in 2021, in 2041, this is what we'll result. I mean, that's how I would look at it. Will it get there? I don't know. I mean, I think that in some sense that the idea that police will just kind of appear on the scene in a situation where they're needed, and they will unleash lethal violence in a very targeted and accurate and effective way. I mean, this is an old fantasy of policing, right? And I think this is the animating fantasy of policing today. I think it's why when people say that defund the police is the wrong slogan, it's because they believe that what police do is kind of appear on the scene, hop out, shoot the bad guy, protect the protect the community, and everything works out great. I mean, it doesn't happen now, and this kind of surgical precision doesn't exist now, and I think there's no reason to think it would exist in the future. But the fantasy is long lasting and powerful and clearly persistent, and I think will persist. So, I think that what we will find in the future is that the kind of pathologies of policing as they are today, which is not to say that they're deviations, but their policing is the pathology. Racism, violence toward unarmed people, focus on the poor and working class instead of the rich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those will persist in a future, more technologically advanced version of policing, as long as our society remains, defined by racism, extreme forms of economic inequality due to, capitalism's continued operation, and the, again, increasing threat of climate disaster, COVID type disasters. It's like we have COVID-19, and I think the kind of expectation is that, like, to the extent that COVID-19 is vanquished, COVID 2023 will come along. And, these types of pathogens, I think, are going to continue to be a huge problem. So, like, is policing going to be up to the task of fixing them? No, of course not, because it had nothing to do except exacerbate in many ways the problems of COVID-19, whether through the way that border policing has operated in COVID-19, or through the ways that the virus has passed through jails and prisons and ICE detention facilities. The first protest, like, if 2020 was a year of protests against police and law enforcement power, the first protests of 2020 were in ICE detention facilities, in March, because of COVID, right? And I think we need to kind of keep that in mind as we think about, like, okay, what is the fantasy of technological dominance attached to in terms of its intended achievements? Again, it gets us back to this fundamental question of, like, what is security? What are we talking about when we talk about security? So yeah, I think that some of these fantasies of technological transformation, they're already occurring. But I mean, let's just put it this way. The theorist Fred Moten referred to Darren Wilson, the cop who killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, referred to him as a drone, meaning he's sent to do a targeted killing in this area, and that's his purpose. So if we are already thinking of police as individual police officers as drones or drone-like, the replacement of them with a kind of autonomously AI operated drone, well, will it look that much different? Or will it still be doing the kinds of things like shooting, the equivalent of Mike Brown down in the street? I mean, that's what that video showed. I think that, the way that it presented it was like that this is policing operating the right way, the way it should operate. And then we end up with, we end up with Mike Brown, we end up with Freddie Gray, we end up with George Floyd, Sandra Bland, et cetera. So yeah, so I'm pessimistic. That's I think what I'm conveying here.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Schrader, for joining me today in my first interview ever. And thanks everybody for watching us, and hope I'll see you once again. Talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.